Our sprints are 3-week cycles instead of 2 weeks. We operate in a sprint of 3 weeks and a cycle of 4 sprints, so it basically maps out to be like a quarter. And inside of those 3-week sprints, we have a series of rituals that the core team all attends. Folks that are coming to a hospital, right, aren't usually coming for like the happiest reasons. So anytime that we can find ways to make their lives easier, right, and more straightforward and less ambiguous, the better. By building in web components, we're able to support Angular, React, and a handful of other future products or ecosystems that the front is looking at. So what we're able to do is scope the pilot to say, okay, here's a set of goals for the internal team, right? Here's what we want to validate and check on and whatever. Here's a set of goals for the participants that are going to be part of the pilot, like our consumers. They need to use a component in a production experience.
Hello, Taylor. It's so great to meet you and have you here on the podcast. And I read a lot about you. I also remember a lot of your talks and podcasts. Currently, you're leading design systems at Mayo Clinic, but previously you were design lead at Fidelity Investment. And I would love to hear how would you describe yourself, because it's quite unusual. You worked in branding and marketing before, but now you ended up working at Mayo Clinic, which is like the world's largest clinic.
It's been a fun journey and a very bizarre one. And I want to take a second. I'm stoked to be here. So thank you for the kind words about my content. I've been following the design system guide and all of your stuff, Romina, for years. So I'm pumped we get to do this together. Yeah, my path was kind of nonlinear and a little bit bizarre. So I've been in the system space for about 6 years now, give or take, working at, kind of full time. So Mayo Clinic is obviously my current role. I lead the systems team there. We have a handful of dedicated designers and engineers, kind of working to scale and to retool some of the systems that are working and not working for us there. But prior to that, I worked at Hologram. It was an IoT, or is an IoT connectivity company. I was the systems lead there, helped build their program. And then prior to that, Fidelity Investments and I was a senior UX designer on that team. And that's kind of where I got my start in this world. But I think your question about the like branding and going into how I kind of landed here it's a fun one, because I like to connect those dots. Like I don't have a traditional design background in the sense of like I didn't go to design school, right? I don't have an engineering degree. I didn't do like the agency life. I wasn't a big web designer back in the day. I have my degree path, and what I pursued in undergrad, or like at the end of the tenure there, was I have a degree in teaching. So technology, design, engineering, education kind of is the overarching role title there. But I always did design work kind of throughout high school and into college and after college. And it was just always a theme there of like doing like journalism design of like page layouts and then things like that. And then I would do like logos. And then when like web became a thing, I started doing like little splash pages. So design was always part of my desire and the things I was interested in. When it became like a viable career path, going into the original marketing and branding and stuff, it was a no-brainer. And systems kind of fell into my lap when I was working at Fidelity Investments. The team I was working on was going through some transitions, and we were figuring out new scopes of work, and I was sitting in on some internal meetings, and they had just hired 8Shapes with Nathan Curtis to come in and do kind of an overhaul and an assessment of the work. So he was doing his readout and doing the workshop with the core team and everything, and then I was there just listening in, and I just fell in love with the work. I mean, it just sounded so interesting to me. Like, it was Fidelity Investments was my first true, purely like UX focused job, and it was new water for me. So that was my first true transition from like the marketing hybrid role, from like doing some web and UX work to like, but still doing a lot of like marketing and like presentation design and brand stuff, into a more fully like, I don't do any of that anymore. We're going straight up into, web and UX and UI as we know it today. And because of that, like I was really nervous, right? Coming into that. It was the first time I was able to jump into that. I had landed at Fidelity after a layoff. So I wasn't there, because I was like, I want to change into UX. Like that didn't happen. So when I fell into the systems project, everything kind of clicked for me, because all of the principles of like good branding, right? And all the stuff we do with marketing on like getting people involved with stuff, all of that translated very easily into the system space, right? Like talk about branding connection, like it's the same idea, right? Systems are parts of a whole working together to create, a unified aesthetic, a unified functionality. And that's kind of no different than a brand, right? When you think about the marketing side, like we owe our consumers and the people we build these tools for to properly explain what's going on and give them time for releases and get them excited about the work. And that's no different than marketing. So all of the kind of sideways paths I've had so far have kind of led and contributed to getting into the system space and really carving out a little niche for myself in this ever budding kind of world.
And in a way, it's also educating all the time. because when you do something, you have to educate everyone what's going on. But what made you fall in love with systems? Because branding still feels more creative. And on the other hand, when you're doing a design system, you need a lot of systematic work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what really resonated for me was the people side of it. So what I liked about both the branding and the system side is like getting agreement amongst a bunch of people, having to like talk about them through the ideas, the convincing and the push and the pull and the collaborative nature. I was never big on the independent like deep dive work, right? All graphic design and design work for that matter requires deep focus sometimes, right? And so when I was doing the branding work and that sort of space, I enjoyed that the individual contributor like building out the stuff side of it, but I enjoyed the coordination and the people management and the strategy and the translation of those things more. So when systems kind of popped up, that was almost a bigger focus at the time. And when the program started at Fidelity, we weren't redesigning everything. We had to get folks to understand what we were doing. So that it felt like a very natural, easy transition. So I was lucky enough to jump into that work like right then and there when we were kind of architecting a new ecosystem, figuring out what, design systems meant at Fidelity versus elsewhere. So while the team was learning about the stuff, I was also learning, right? And it bought me a lot of space to figure that out. But I was able to channel that oh, I like the people side of this. That's where I thrive. Like I like the strategy like of the brand side. That's an easy application into this idea of alignment, consistency, and systems. So it just felt really easy for me in terms of like it's the same thing. So we're still having the same meetings, we're still building the same briefs, we're still discussing deadlines and timelines, it's just a different output. And so the transition was a little bit easier for me in that regard. But I really enjoyed that the systems world also um, seemed to bridge the technology gap more than like the branding world did, right? So in the sense of like branding and marketing design, I mean, there's a million flavors and spaces in which that can transcend beyond creative. In my experience, like in that space, you kind of got stuck in the creative and marketing funnels, for lack of a better word, in terms of your impact on the work. And there's nothing wrong with that, nothing at all. In fact, it's essential for those things to happen. But when dipping my toes into systems, I realized it gave me a chance to all of a sudden like get deeper into engineering and technical understandings of things and the producty side of why we're doing the thing we're doing. So it allowed for building on the things I enjoyed, right? That community, that teaching, that socialization, and flavor it from different angles that I would not have access to before and that I didn't get from the branding and marketing path. So it's new levels of collaboration, deeper understanding of why we do the things we do and how we build the things we build more than just, the pretty design artifact. I started to really understand, not from an engineering lens as like to code it, but to understand the design choices and how they made it into code. And that was invaluable to get the understanding of like, well, if we're going to build a system that works, it's got to work for multiple disciplines, right? We can't just look in one lane. Otherwise, we're just building more sticker sheets, right? And that's not what we need.
Yeah, exactly. But to put things into context, what's Mayo Clinic, and can you share a little bit more about your current team and structure, and then we can go from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm at the Mayo Clinic now. I've been there for 2 years. The Mayo Clinic is one of the leading health care institutions in the US, if not the top. I know there's like little different measurement scales on which that adjusts. But we are aiming to continually create experiences for patients and folks seeking medical advice and information as a category of one service. So when we think about like the way that Mayo architects its like medical services and then what it wants out of its digital properties, it's a natural transition, a natural obvious thing that like, hey, you need a system, right, a design system to help architect and ensure that we can create that highest level possible performance and quality and consistency and experience for folks that are coming to the Mayo Clinic at arguably times of most need, right? When they're seeking advice about a condition they may have or services for an illness they're experiencing or trying to understand what's occurring with them and their family. So folks that are coming to a hospital, right, aren't usually coming for like the happiest reasons. So anytime that we can find ways to make their lives easier, right, and more straightforward and less ambiguous, the better. So when you abstract that from the system, right, we are helping the internal teams build the better products for the patients and folks looking for medical advice. My team today is two senior product designers, two senior engineers, one tech lead, and one accessibility expert. We get partial support from an accessibility lead internally and a content writer internally, as well as a director on the XD side and an engineering manager on the IT side. But our team is very lean at the moment. We're about 5 people. I'm currently hiring for a principal role. design role to bolster the other side of the team. But we're in our early stages of our systems journey. So we're getting ready to launch a pilot here in Q1 of 2025 to validate all the new fun architecture stuff that we've been helping massage and fix and fill gaps on in the past year.
So you're actually just doing a new design system or rebuilding the old one?
Yeah, a little bit of rebuilding. So Mayo had tried to do the design system thing many times in the past, and for good and bad reason, it has sometimes worked and sometimes not. The organization has gone through a few layers of change in terms of the way they architect their tech stack and do staffing. So naturally, with that, the needs have changed, and through generations of the way the department was set up, the different types of systems and different attempts at systems has happened in different areas of the business. But when I had joined, there was an effort to align all of that to try to get to a single source of truth. So that's when I came in, was at that point, after many teams had done really great work on getting some initial establishment done. But to their credit, the work that was done was very, very helpful, right? It got teams aligned in the first place. But where it was missing was that they didn't have the systematic layer, right? The connectivity between code and design and doc and the things that make systems performant and scalable. So they had all the right pieces, but there wasn't a strategy to help make sure that that could stay performant and living beyond, first delivery. So we're trying to lay the groundwork now to also change the culture around how systems are understood and worked and how engineering and design works together and how a system is not something that holds people back creatively. It actually helps us, make more creative decisions, in addition to making sure that we can serve that category of one type experience for internal and external people.
Is the system or this dashboard connecting on one side patients and on the other side also doctors? So you can log in with your account and then you can see the info that you're sharing. So I would assume that this is really hard when you're building a design system because you have to make sure that all these users are happy and the use case is different. So how did you research all of this? I mean, did you do interviews or what was the process?
Yeah. That's a great question, because you're right. I think that's the thing we forget to talk about oftentimes. In terms of our user base, right, and the people that will actually use and consume the design system, we do have very different folks. We've got the public.org site. So like when folks go to mayoclinic.org and like go to that portal and they can, read articles and content and do some self-service on what they think may be helpful for medical advice, understand news from the Mayo Clinic, all that stuff on the public website. That's a logged out experience. There's also the logged in experience, the patient portal, right? So when you become a patient at Mayo Clinic, you're similar to like, any doctor that has like the My Epic portal and that sort of thing. Mayo has a flavor of that as well. And so you'll have a post login experience that's for the patient, right? To monitor your test results and your health status and then your appointments. And then there's the third group, the one that you're talking about, like kind of the doctors and all the internal staff and that stuff. So there are at least three distinct groups that have three distinct needs, right? Which is ever complicated for us. So what we've decided to begin with is starting small and expanding, right? So we're not trying to boil the ocean, because if we try to do too many things at once, especially with a newly cultural system, in the sense that folks at Mayo Clinic are still learning and understanding how to interact with the system, where its limitations start, where they stop. So we wanted to be really intentional about not giving them too much to the point where it becomes overwhelming. So we're starting with web at first and punting native mobile support till probably next year, till we get to our next major release. But we're also focusing on the public, so that .org site where people can access things, and the patient view first. So those are the first kind of setups to give us our baseline. And we're building a scalable token infrastructure and making decisions for the components and things that we have to make sure that they are scalable to the additional use cases that we'll be able to support in the long term. And we're trying our best not to architect anything in a way that locks us into any decisions. In other words, we don't know yet if when we start to support the practitioner side, so like the doctors or the folks doing all that very big like data analysis and like reading through test results, a very different person, very different view than a patient, like you mentioned. We don't know yet if that's going to be on the same system, right, in terms of the actual tech stack, or if we, in that case, we can get away with using the design system and maybe forking it, right, and creating a subsystem for that area of the business if it needs it. Or maybe we can get away with doing that through theming. Like there's so many different mechanisms on ways we can support that different display, but we wanted to make sure we landed the infrastructure and hardened our processes so that when we comes time to expand our consumer pool or the products we support, we do it in a responsible way. We're not trying to just take in everything at once and then create a situation where we can't maintain the work that we're building for those audiences.
Yeah, in what What did you do for the pilot? I mean, is this just a few components and testing out the token structure, or you're actually building all the components?
Great question. Yeah. So, and you asked earlier, and I skipped over it. So we went to get to know what we needed to do. We did a big listening tour, a big sentiment analysis. So we met with each different business unit, or the folks within those different cohorts, and we did a few sessions. So we met with the engineers, we met with the designers, and we met with the product folks for each of those categories. So there's a lot of meetings. But what we did is we recorded in a quadrant diagram the hopes and fears about the future of the design system ecosystem at Mayo, and kind of gauged understanding there, and then also recorded what was working and not working today. So we did that over the course of about a month and a half and collected a bunch of data from everyone from like the director level to the ICs to the leads, so we can really paint a picture of what was really working with the current ecosystems, what was missing, and where things we can evolve and map to. What helped us scope the pilot is we're able to find specific issues and pinpoints from the consumers that would effectively later use this new evolution of the design system we're using, but we're able to root it in user feedback directly, because there was and is an existing quote unquote system today. It's just not as connected or performant in the way that we as like deep practitioners know it can be. So we're able to use that as like the baseline to go, hey, what's working in this thing and not working? Tell us where the problems are. What, are you missing certain components, or are certain functions just not working at all and therefore you can't use them? Just all that digging. So all that information helped us land a first set of guidance and what we want to do for the pilot. So what we're doing in terms of our pilot is we have spent the last couple of months doing all of our infrastructure work, setting up all our CI/CD pipelines and our delivery mechanisms and our documentation site and our feature processes, all the things we need as a team to make sure that like we can deliver repeatedly and performantly. Thanks to that data that we collected, we also identified that in 2025, there was a lot of emphasis on some of the form flows that consuming teams and product teams are working on. So it made sense for us to not only pick a small subset of initial components to build as part of the first kind of test to make sure that our pipelines worked and our delivery methods work and our tokens, scaled as appropriately, but it also was a nice kind of double bonus that the org needed form components. So what we did is we scoped a very small number of components to build for the pilot, so that the pilot could serve as a time where consuming teams can test those components. So for example, we built like buttons and text inputs and checkbox and radio, a lot of those common form controls, because even the ones that were existing prior, they weren't meeting accessibility standards, and they were a few versions in terms of tech framework behind. So it was a good double bang for your buck project, in that like it gives us a chance to really test our processes and our flows on building some real things that the org needs. Two, giving us a set of components to use in the pilot that are built exactly how we would want them to be built, right? And these are arguably like low hanging fruit components that don't need a lot of customization and deep thought, right? We know how inputs work, we know how buttons work. There's not any sort of massive uniqueness to those things. So by using those kind of common elements, knowing the company needed them, and the teams that will be consuming will benefit from them, we're using the pilot not only to tease folks into, hey, this is what it's like to use a real system that has all the support that you'd expect, versus a very good attempt at a system that just didn't have dedicated support in the past, and gives us a chance to test all the things we want to validate, right? Are our processes working? Did our deployment work properly? How's our release flow? When a component gets to our end consumer, designer or engineer, is it easy to understand? Can they access the documentation where they need to? So having that small subset of initial objects is going to help us build the next set of objects, because we have something to build upon.
But do you have some time frame? For example, now you will release a pilot and you will test it for, let's say, a month. You will get the feedback, and then so start rolling out the rest of the component.
Yeah, absolutely. So we met with leadership and product all at the end of last year to scope out the kind of the bookends of the pilot. So we got buy-in on the idea of a 90-day pilot that has not kicked off just yet in terms of the tactical side, but we agreed on a 90-day pilot where we would solicit specific applications for teams internally that could apply to be part of the pilot, in addition to having leadership pre-select a few teams that were good fits based on market need or flagship products or whatever. So what we're able to do is scope the pilot to say, okay, here's a set of goals for the internal team, right? Here's what we want to validate and check on and whatever. Here's a set of goals for the participants that are going to be part of the pilot, like our consumers. They need to use a component in a production experience. They need to give us feedback on these specific intervals, what all those constructs are. And then there was a timeline on saying we're going to do this for 90 days. We're going to have check-ins along the way. We're going to have some co-collaboration and co-code and design pairing sessions that'll allow the core team engineers and designers to meet hands-on with this small group of consumers to make sure, we can see how they're using things, and not to police it, but to understand, can we make something a little bit better for you? Or are we missing something? Or is a consumer doing something that we didn't realize was possible, right? Or extra, things like that. So that 90-day period is going to give us a chance to validate that our processes are working, that the consumers are able to use the thing that we built for them, that there's a proper way to deliver feedback to us through bug reports, feature requests, etc., and that we have a plan in place. And this is the part of the test, that when those requests or changes or something come through, can we make that fix, release an update, and do all that in a reasonable amount of time. So we're validating a lot of things in this 90-day window to make sure that it allows us to say, all right, great. Right now we're in the alpha version of our system. We are stable. We are good to go. We are ready for our formal V, and we can launch to the whole org. Or there's some things we need to fix. The pilot has shown us that the alpha was stable, but there are some gaps. Therefore, we're going to do a beta and move forward. So it's an incremental progress milestone for us that we're going to use to validate whether we need kind of more testing, or we are stable enough to get closer to a formal 1.0 where we can release to everyone at the Mayo Clinic rather than just the selected pilot teams that either arrived through applying to be part of the pilot and, we reviewed their candidacy and decided to pick them, or that leadership chose them particularly.
Are you also user testing then with some patients? For example, the dashboard that they use or the doctors on the other side? Or this is
Yeah,
happening after you will have all the components ready?
a little bit of both. So we have a three shield approach to the way Mayo Clinic kind of scopes everything that it does. And one of those shields is research. So everything that the company, the organization does is rooted in deep data and deep research and understanding. So no different than anything else, as are we. So we have a test plan that we're putting together with the UX research department on which things we want to kind of validate and check out. The nice part is that this evolution of the design system is not coming on the back of like a redesign or a big brand overhaul. So the visual style, for the most part, is pretty much set already, and it's performant and ready to go. The only adjustments we're making to it are for accessibility updates, right? If there's any kind of color, contrast adjustment or something like that. So the impact to the end consumer, right, at least in this first phase, meaning the patients and stuff, is minimal, which is what we were hoping for. We didn't want to create disruption or some sort of new experience or things that our consuming teams then need to test and validate for the patients just yet. Right now, we're at the stage of like, I'll just make up an example. There's 100 teams building 100 form inputs, all looking and functioning the same. This is a waste of time and money. If we centralize, we can scale and build and performantly make sure that this stays in lockstep. So we're very much at that stage. But we do have, like I said, partnership and plans with the research teams for during the pilot testing in ways that we can say, hey, can you help us validate with the consumers? Or if something does ship to production, can you sneak in a few design system questions in your research plan that you'll be doing when you validate, product launch? And we're working with them in a more long-term capacity to say, when doing specific A/B testing or other user tests or things like that, are there a subset or a handful of design system specific questions that we can have kind of baked into each of those studies? Or if we have something that we're shipping this new feature and it happens to make it into this test, we have some specific questions. So we're creating that connective tissue between us and the research org so that we can get valuable insight from the patients without having to do our own user research, because in our space, getting access to those patients and doctors and things like that comes with the understanding that that's sharing a lot of private candid information, and there's layers to being able to directly speak to certain individuals. So we're trying to be respectful of those quote unquote chains of command as well, so that we don't accidentally do harm, right, instead of doing something good.
Were there a lot of healthcare privacy issues or something that you needed to be really careful also with design choices?
It's a good question. Thankfully, since we're not doing much of an overhaul, we haven't had to think much into that. And what I mean by that is that since the system is going to have the same visual style, right, in terms of what it displays, at the end of the day, the responsibility of showing or not showing patient data is on the product teams that are building specific experiences. So we're creating objects inside of our design system that will allow you to pass in, patient data or connect to some sort of backend data service or a CMS, but nothing inside the system itself has anything that has anything to do with patient data, anything that's confidential, nothing. In fact, we're attempting to charter a path where we can make the system public so others can see it as we validate that the code and the design and everything that we supply as the design system and in that scope doesn't include anything that would put us at risk or that would connect to any kind of confidential information, whether it's patient data or medical data or anything like that. So thankfully, no. For us, we didn't have to deal with that. What we did have to deal with, though, and this is some of that stuff that I don't think we as systems practitioners talk about enough and things like this, is like while the system itself did not have to worry about those security things, in order to get our infrastructure set up, right, we had to do a lot with the IT department to make sure our code base was in the right place, or we had to get some tooling turned on or turned off that may or may not have been accessible to most teams, right, on the way they deploy their pipelines, because we're, hitting many teams at the top level, from a repository perspective versus like one team in their own vertical that never needs to get out of that repo. So we encountered issues on that side, right, on making sure that IT's infrastructure and how their repositories and stuff are set up and permissions are set up will enable a team like ours to share to multiple areas across the org that each have their own security protocols and stuff. So that's an interesting challenge that we didn't expect to experience, and has been, frankly, one of the more fruitful but challenging things to navigate around, because all we're trying to do at the end of the day, right, is build a thing that folks can use, and if they can't access it, then we have a problem, right? So it's all those interesting up and down trade-off discussions.
So I would assume that you're not allowed to use any tool. I mean, can you talk about tools that you're using for the
Yeah, sure. So on the design side of the house, we're using Figma. That's pretty obvious, right? So that's our design tool. But we do have some teams that are working on WYSIWYG experiences inside of things like AEM, right? Adobe Experience Manager. So we have to support that kind of drag and drop tooling ecosystem as well for kind of non-typical designer engineer folk like product or marketing groups. But as far as the design tool stack, it's primarily in Figma. There are some like Adobe Illustrator folks and things like that in the creative realm, but we have teammates that we pair with to make sure we can meet their side. On the other side of the house, on the tech side, it was a little more complicated, right? Obviously, because every org, has oftentimes different areas of the business that are, say, on Angular or on React or using web components or whatever, right? And we're aiming for this unilateral centralized tech stack, right? If we can support it. But what's interesting is we encountered a challenge, as most do at large organizations, that the company wasn't necessarily ready to convert everybody over to one framework. Like, it's not something that people can just hit a magic switch on, right? If some teams are on Angular and some teams are on React, well, you can't just change that with a magic switch. So we had to find ways to be able to deliver expansive code, especially for web, so that we could hit the different frameworks and different places that we need to hit. The tech lead on the team, she did a lot of deep dive and digging into figuring out what would be the way that we can performantly and responsibly deliver the code side of things in a way that we can transpose and interoperably swap out, for lack of a better word, aspects of the code to make it, perform it and support it for other frameworks. So we decided to use the lit library. So lit.dev is a really good web component kind of structure that allows you to export all sorts of things in different ways. And so by building in web components, we're able to support Angular, React, and a handful of other future products or ecosystems that the front is looking at. So from a tech stack perspective, we went that route. We have individual packages for each of our components and our tokens and that sort of stuff to allow for independent versioning and teams to adopt pieces of the system rather than having to take the whole thing. So our tech ecosystem works that way. On our documentation site, we're currently using Supernova, which has been really helpful to make sure that, it's an easy, tool to drag and drop and do stuff in. But that's kind of where the buck stops. We're not using any connective tools like Token Studio or anything like that to formally connect any of our repos to anything or design tools to code. And that's mainly because of the infrastructure that Mayo has and just the little things that make that challenging or not beneficial in some respects, and just the general lack of interest in relying on third-party tools at a large enterprise where there's, we have the capacity to do some of this stuff more manually or more in a less automated fashion for certain reasons. So we try not to lean on third-party tools that we don't have support on or really know information out about in totality, because the other side of that is even when we do need to do that, like for example, we wanted to use Chromatic for our UI regression testing and tracking those flows. To get that to go through the security review internally took a very long time. So once we realized that each time we wanted a new tool or wanted to test a new functionality or a plugin or something like that, it would have to go through all these layers of security review, which makes sense, right? When we're talking about potential access to patient data and, you connect the wrong repo to the wrong thing, all of a sudden, big breach, right? On the code side, it makes sense. So the time it took to dig into those tools and analyze them, again, business-wise, we get it. in terms of not slowing us down, big challenge, right? Because it took months to get a tool reviewed. And we're like, well, we needed this like a week ago. So we're trying our best to use the tools that we can use that already fall under the approval list, and then be very intentional when we want to go outside of that ecosystem. So we're not, wasting time and resources analyzing these things.
So are you using then Figma variables for design?
We are. Yeah, we are. But what we're not doing is directly connecting them through any sort of repo ingestion, or anything like that. The tokens translation is such an interesting like thing to dig into, right? Because like when you talk about like looking at tokens and like understanding them in a code editor or whatever, like it's a little more clear. But design tools just haven't truly caught up to the way they work. So we've made some very interesting and intentional choices on where to store certain things in variables versus certain things in styles versus certain things in just click and drag type of interactive objects. So it's been fun to watch the team kind of explore, what's right for the system versus what's right as far as what Figma is like stably supporting and ready to use. And then the additional layer of like Figma is also new to Mayo Clinic. So they've only been on Figma for about 2 or 3 years. So a lot of the folks inside are still learning the tool. So when, Figma drops variables with something new, it's like it's a whole new aspect of things that our consumers need to learn too. So we're trying to be careful on if the system uses the cutting edge, new feature, but the teams that are using the system don't understand how to use those tools or aren't ready to use those tools, then we're actually building in things that can cause them to diverge, right? Or not adopt because it makes it too hard. So variables is a good example, right? We're trying not to over variabilize, right? Or create, theme switchers and stuff when the org isn't ready for those tools yet. They're still understanding the tool where it is today. So that has bought us some air cover on not having to like over engineer our Figma ecosystem. But what it's also kind of helping us figure out is what's the next level of intricacy do we want to tackle, right? So we're doing some component sets, we're doing some variables, we're doing some styles and some of those connected things, but we're not doing anything in totality or anything in a way that is, like I said, connected to code. So we'll see how that shapes up in the future, especially as Figma continues to roll out new features and figure out how that ecosystem works. So, and then things like Token Studio continue to advance. We can continue to figure out the best way to utilize our design tools.
But how do you then map out the decisions? For example, whatever's happening in code or any changes, and then on the design side, do you also have some of spreadsheets for components and design tokens? I mean, all this design.
Sure. Yeah. That's a good question. So we track those things in multiple ways. So as far as the work, right, and understanding when a task starts and stops, and what goes into doing something, we use Asana for our project tracking. So we've got a very robust and well documented feature process that starts from everything from the discovery of a feature that ends with, are we going to prioritize this feature and work on it, or are we going to put it in the backlog, right? All the way down to the release of that feature, and that covers everything from the design, the build, the documentation, the release notes, all that stuff. And all of that is tracked in Asana. So we've got that kind of written down in a change log fashion. That is more for new features and things like that. We also have a token taxonomy spreadsheet that we use. It's a smart Excel spreadsheet where we've built out our infrastructure and what each of our areas of our schema are in quite literally a drop-down menu way, so that when we need to generate or think through new tokens, we can do that in Excel and play with the schema, and before we actually deliver or ship the token, and see how it fits into our schema, if we need to update that or adopt that schema to change for something new, or if it's working, so we can have like a little test environment before we move it into something like, a code review or including it into our actual tooling. But once it does kind of make it past that, like, okay, yes, we need a token for an interactive primary, just going to make something up, right? When that validation happens and we're good to go, our system operates from a mindset of code is truth, Figma is an emulation, right? It's where our designers are, but at the end of the day, code choice and delivery is the more important thing in terms of like, it's the real thing. So what we try to do is we start from code, right? And having our designers and our engineers collaborate and go, okay, let's work on, we use the token example, add this token to our schema, to the package, first, right? We know exactly how that's going to work, where that works in our schema. Then we translate that into Figma, right? So right now we're using a library structure where we keep all of our visual style in a specific library. Some of that is input through variables, some of that's through styles. But we have a translation layer. That's not an actual tool, just a process in which we take things from that spreadsheet, that schema spreadsheet, as our like translation source of truth. Like the engineers go, great, we put that into code now. And the designers go, great, we'll put that into Figma now. And so we have a specific spot in our process in which that happens. And when we kind of fork and go and we divulge or diverge and go, okay, designers go put it where it needs to go, engineers go put it where it needs to go. and then we maintain those ecosystems separately, because we do have the benefit of having a full dedicated team to support these things. So we don't need to necessarily use generator tools or tools that have opinion baked into them. We're able to kind of roll our own and maintain our own ecosystem and process around this, so that we can stay close to it in a way that helps make sure we can monitor status as we get through the pilot. I don't know what's going to look like. We get to V1, maybe we'll figure out everything's working great and we connect it through Token Studio or something. But right now we're at a very manual stage.
So how do you collaborate? I mean, you mentioned Asana. Do you only work, or do you mainly work async? Or do you have, let's say, weekly meetings where you decide on which components will you work, or how does this happen?
Yeah, great question. So the team works on like a modified version of Agile. And what I mean by that is, so our designers and our engineers and our rotational team members, our accessibility lead and our copywriters and those sorts of things, are all involved in our sprints. Our sprints are 3-week cycles instead of 2 weeks. We operate in a sprint of 3 weeks and a cycle of 4 sprints. So it basically maps out to be like a quarter. And inside of those 3-week sprints, we have a series of rituals that the core team all attend. And then we have things that are discipline specific. So for example, we have the first Monday of each sprint is a wind down session, just kind of like a, hey, cool, we just started the sprint. Like, let's hang out together and just bond, right? We're not here to do work all the time. Let's just enjoy each other's company. So that's kind of the nice team building kind of style thing, to make sure it's not all work, that there's some play, right? So that's the low hanging fruit one. Twice a week, we have what we call touch point. And that's where we do like critiques and deep dive discussions and reviews and that sort of thing. That's the whole team there. We have an agenda, we take notes, we log decisions, we log next steps. And we have 2 90-minute sessions that are optional, right? The team can come or not come. We keep an agenda file so we know if there is things to discuss or not. But that happens, like I said, at least twice a week inside each of the 3-week sprints. Those are the deep dive, full team, all there to discuss things and unpack. And sometimes we invite guests like our accessibility experts or whatever to help us dig into things. The designers and the engineers also have independent collaboration sessions where just the designers get together to jam and just the engineers weekly. So they have a dedicated pairing session where they can jump and have each other's time to make sure, because we are all working remotely. So we're across multiple time zones. And so this schedule is one that maps with everybody's, working hours. So that's the tactical part in terms of getting the work done. In terms of prioritization and work tracking, we also have a refinement session once a sprint where we look through the backlog, check to make sure, what's there, if anything new has come in, if we added anything new, to make sure that whatever tasks we have there are as clear as possible in terms of what work needs to be done for them, and then what, is considered done, right? How we know that work is finished. So that backlog session happens weekly. That is mainly myself, the lead engineer, and our leadership, but the core team will attend and help out, and then dig in with us when they have the time. Following our refinement sessions, we have a additional session each sprint that's planning. So we discuss towards the end of the sprint, the last week of the sprint, hey, is there anything that we're working on during this 3-week stint that we will not finish, and therefore we'll roll to the next, right? So that's kind of our first line item in that meeting. And then the second item is, great, now let's look at all the stuff we refined in the backlog and plan for the next sprint, so we can responsibly know at least 1 to 2 sprints ahead what will be coming next. And then the last ritual we have each sprint is a retro. So we make sure that we take a moment to acknowledge any successes and wins we had in that 3-week period, any challenges we had, anything that went wrong that we want to address and create kind of next steps for. So this 3-week cycle happens, like I said, every 3 weeks and restarts, and has been a really effective mechanism to make sure that the team has a lot of time to intentionally get together and collaborate, but also time for deep work. And in addition to just design work and just engineer work. So there's a lot of meaningful connection points for multidisciplinary teammates to collaborate, discuss, decide, prioritize, etc. But also, again, leaving space for that, knowing that design and engineering all need heads down time to kind of knock out that stuff that they need to do, and then be able to bring that back for discussion.
Yeah, that's really cool, because 3 weeks, 2 weeks is often too not enough time, but 3 weeks is amazing because you also have time to actually prioritize and have
Right.
time for deep work.
Yeah. Well, and the 3-week structure actually started as an experiment at Hologram. So I was there when I was working at Hologram. I was the lead designer on the system there. And I was working with a guy named Kevin Powell. He's a great engineer. The two of us were mainly leading the system infrastructure. And what we had realized is, having worked at other places, the 2-week structure didn't work. at least for design systems, right? Because so much of our work depended on going out and talking to the community and digging in with research and design and engineering and spending time with our consumers. So we always felt that like the 2 week sprint was effective when you knew exactly who you're working with in some respects and had a really tight scope. But for our work, as we all know, right, that we have so many people and things that we can dive into. So adding that additional week carved out time to make sure we had time to go in and talk to the community, right? Because if we're not talking to them, then we're not building for them. So that construct we adopted at Mayo. Now, what we're missing from our rituals today, because we're still in our building the pilot phase, is we also plan to do demos, right? At least once a sprint, so that folks can know what's coming, what has worked well, what didn't work well, all the expansive kind of release kind of stuff. So we're not doing those yet, but that will be coming soon during the pilot. And then the other thing we want to do is those discipline specific sessions where we've got the designers working together and the engineers. We want to find a way to open that up to the community as well. So that designers can come to the design jam hour and either just see how we work or ask questions or challenge us or whatever. And same thing for engineering. So we can make sure we create more deep rooted connection to our consumers so that we're not just like building things and throwing it to them, right? But there's a constant push and pull inside of that. And we can, make sure that there's review cycles and weigh-ins and that sort of thing to ensure that we're building the right thing at the right time. And that's the piece that we don't have yet. But that additional week adds time for that, right? Beyond the normal meeting schedule. And when we bake it into it intentionally, I feel that from a mission and charter perspective, it helps consuming groups, so the designers, engineers, product folks inside the company feel supported, right? They know that like this thing is built for them and will be maintained for them. It's not just some other product on the shelf that just has performance goals and delivers and moves on, right? It makes sure that we have enough time and intentionality to vet the work, check the work, discuss the work, dig in with the work so that when we release something, it's not, oh, something came from the design system, it may or may not work. It's they took the time to do this and check with us and whatever. We are ready, prepared, and excited about this feature, and it's going to help us, right? And that's kind of a core tenet of what we're trying to build here.
So, what's your take on prioritization? Probably it's not the time right now because you're in the pilot mode, but how did you do it maybe in previous companies?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned earlier, though, we ended up prioritizing this particular set of form features in a kind of an ad hoc prioritization way. Like there wasn't like a big backlog to look against or some big roadmap, but we're able to see what other teams needed when we discussed with our leadership, like, hey, we believe that this set of form components, for example, is the right thing to build now. It's the right thing to build first, and it'll help us when we come to pilot was our lightweight version of prioritization, right? So right now we're still doing that pilot exercise, right? And you're right. There's not much prioritization in terms of the future happening. But what I can say is how we did it at Fidelity and how we did it at Hologram is likely going to be a very similar way that we do here at Mayo. And that is, we know, as a system team, in terms of what we built and what our infrastructure is ready for, what might be the logical next set of components, right? We have our list of things or features, right? I try to bucket them as features because we don't always deliver components. Like sometimes it's documentation, sometimes it's pattern, sometimes it's a token, whatever. Whatever features we're working on next will hopefully come from community sentiment. And we have an idea of what that might be. Like we've been collecting reference screens. We meet with the leads in design and engineering to know kind of what's coming next in their worlds. So we can try to meet the needs, but we're not doing that in earnest today at Mayo. At Fidelity and at Hologram, we had two layers of ways to ensure that we were doing that. Number one was getting involved as much as we could with the readouts and prioritization matrices and quarterly planning sessions that other product teams are having so that we can know, okay, cool, flagship app is doing big update on dashboard A, whatever it is, right? Or they're doing rebrand Y, so we need to get ahead of that, right? So the sooner we could listen in and hear those things, the sooner we could scale or adjust or shift priority to do what's next, right? It's kind of always a lagging indicator in some regard, right? That like product team makes choice, system reacts. And I don't love that situation, but it's just the way it seems to organically happen. But what we're trying to do here and what worked well at Hologram is to get ahead of those things. We were in as many of the kind of platform level meetings as possible. So know like, all right, big change coming here. System needs to flex and architect this other thing or set of features or plans to support this in the future. Or new product Y is launching. Cool. We know that there's some gaps in the system that we should think about filling before they get started, all that sort of stuff. So in terms of keeping track of work, that's those mechanisms, like getting involved in those readouts, whatever. The other things that we have set up here and had at other orgs was a bug request form. Like that's the easy one. Like there's something wrong with the thing that we gave you. Here's how you report that problem so we can dive in and check on it and ask a bunch of questions. And hey, did you try to fix it yourself? Can you give us some files, examples, like all the stuff we would need? There's also a feature request form that's kind of a parallel to that one of like, hey, you want a thing that we don't have? Cool, tell us about it, right? What is it that you feel you need? And those are the self-service options that folks will have, like whenever they need to just go onto the doc site, click the link, fill out the form. But part of those community sessions, we also have an office hours. That was the other ritual I forgot to mention. That's open to everybody. So it's an hour every few weeks. They can jump in and ask us questions about the system or just systems practices in general, share information, ask questions. So that session, in addition to the other discipline specific sessions, we're going to use those to gauge and understand kind of what's coming next at the product level. So we can go, we're seeing this shift in more modal centric design. I'm making something up, right? So maybe we should support a modal, right? Or, oh, we're seeing more folks thinking about dark mode. Maybe we should prioritize the strategy on dark mode, whatever. So all these different touch points, whether it's their formal roadmap planning or the jam sessions with the folks that we will facilitate, or it's the regular departmental demos, there's multiple inputs for us to try to stay ahead and collaborate with the right teams at the right time. And it's just a matter of making sure we have good coverage on seeing all that stuff.
Yeah, sounds like a great process. I mean, there's not a lot of teams, that have really structured everything so systematically as you're describing right now.
It's a lot of overhead. But I think the beauty of that is none of this is like unique to me, right? None of this is original thought. This is stuff that like has come from, working on different systems, different orgs, and frankly, just wanting to try some new things, right? And wanting to see what works for us, knowing that there's no one way to do any of this work, right? And I think the beautiful thing about systems is like the frameworks and the approaches and the concepts. None of that is proprietary or secret, right? In terms of like, oh, how we do our design tokens isn't like a proprietary thing, right? Like you can learn from one org or another org. So I think it's important to like all of us to recognize that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? On all this stuff. Like systems are not a new thing, right? The tooling and the approaches have been around for decades. What is new is the formalized discipline of saying we have practitioners that do this at a full-time capacity at XYZ company. So it's an interesting juxtaposition between like new formal role, old concept and tooling now being tucked into new formal role, right? So like what I like to think about in that kind of aspect of things is like nothing we're doing is revolutionary, right? In terms of like prioritization and building things. So we can learn so much from other areas of the business, right? So like we meet with solution engineering, for example, at Mayo and our architecture teams because they've been doing that work for eons, right? And have been doing that for the Mayo Clinic for a long time. So it makes sense for us to go talk to them to know, hey, what works best here at the org, rather than wasting time or digging into a million POCs when maybe some of those tools have already been ruled out, right? Or things like that. So leveraging internal departments that are natural partners is an easy way to help bolster some of these processes and make them less intimidating. But the other side too is I think there's other areas of the business that systems in general tend to forget to engage with. Like I think the easy one is like brand, right? Because they're often in a weird separation from UX a lot of times. But even marketing and what I mean by that is like I think the systems world tends to forget that we not only build, the product, the tooling, the resource, whatever you're calling your system, right? There's that thing, but there's also the marketing and the maintenance and the build up and the hype and all the other stuff that you need to make sure it gets used, right? So effectively, systems folks are all content marketers in some way, shape, or form, right? We have to write emails and newsletters and updates and release notes and things to get people not excited about the work, but at least wanting to interact with it, right? Where that's a thing that normal product teams don't have to do, right? They're not the ones that are often advertising the tool they're working on. That's a whole different department, right? So it's unique to systems in that we not only have to build and maintain the thing, but we got to sell it and we got to get buy-in and we got to iterate on it in ways that other product teams don't have. So tapping into other areas of your organizations to help not have to reinvent those things from the wheel, right, is a good practice, right? Go learn from your marketers. I'm like, hey, how do y'all do drip campaigns, right? What does your email newsletter process look like? We don't need to think about this in a fresh perspective. Let's use something that exists, right? Or learn from other departments. So all of this sounds very robust, right? And very calculated, but a lot of it is just culminations of different areas of things that the places I've worked were already normalizing on. So there's no reason to create something new or diverge from a process that already existed. Rather, we can leverage those to our advantage and build upon them so that the system can make it to the right hands of the right people in a way that the company and the people that work here are already used to, right? So better ways to ensure adoption and excitement and satisfaction and outreach and all that, in my opinion, comes from process like this. Now, there is a big risk, and I think that's kind of where you're getting, and like we can over process everything, right? And then don't get to build the thing we want to build. But, that's a risk that I think everyone has to assess as they go.
I mean, I think that for most teams it's scary because they get stuck on actually rebuilding their processes.
Right.
When you're scaling your team or your product, everything is going fine, but then in one moment you realize, oh my God, I cannot scale anymore. So you have to change your processes, and this is the scary part. And design systems often show you all these gaps that already exist, but you didn't notice them before.
Right. Right. Yeah, you're so right, and that's what makes it kind of scary, right? Is because like it's low risk in some regard because like it's an internal tool, right? So if a launch doesn't necessarily go perfectly, right, you're not going to impact revenue. But also on the other side, like if things are going too smoothly, it's like, oh wait, what am I missing? Like what are these gaps? Like you said, what you're talking about. So it's a very weird spot to be in for sure.
Yeah. So where do you see bonding design systems and AI?
Ooh, that's a good question. I have seen some interesting ideas on. So, let's back up for a second. I have a fundamental concern with the increasing use of AI tools, in terms of environmental impact and energy use and the disregard for that. But we'll put all that aside for a second and talk about the benefits, because I think there is benefits to it, especially as new models and things come out. I think in terms of systems, I think there's a lot of talk about like, letting AI tool help write your code or help review your documentation or help do all the things that help us work faster, right? Or make the things that we want to make more performantly. And I think that's certainly one aspect of the AI inside of design systems world. I don't think it's a bad path, right? It's a productivity path. But I think a more interesting approach, a more interesting set of pathways, I've seen some Twitter threads about teams trying this and then wanting to explore it, is the idea of a chatbot that helps consumers better interact with and understand the ways to use the system. Sounds like a much stronger use case for something that helps people make decisions and use the system and frankly address the issues we often feel about adoption and scale and understanding, right? I think there's a good opportunity and something to explore on, and maybe chatbot's the wrong way to describe it, but like an AI tool that helps two things. Number one, helps be a place where consumers don't have to interact with the core team or the team that's supporting the system directly if they just need a quick answer and they don't want to, hey, where do I find this documentation? Like they don't feel that they should reach out about things like that. Like that's often a thing we hear is that folks are like, well, I feel like this is the stupid question. I don't want to look dumb. It's like, well, there's no stupid questions. Like everything is open, right? Ask us. We should be able to help you and respond. But that comes with all the personal, I don't want to ask. I don't want to feel dumb. So if there was a tool like that, like a chatbot that was able to like scrape the documentation site and scrape the code base and scrape Figma to like help folks understand where and how to use things, I think that's a huge opportunity on one side. I think the other side of that opportunity is if you can figure out ways to inlay data translation, right, and output from that search query situation, I think there's a lot of valuable information you can use from that on the other side. So imagine you've got consumers going, I don't know what the difference between a tile and a card are. Right, as a very easy, common, naming issue, right? And the chatbot tells you, well, our system uses cards, and it's no different than a tile. It's just a container, blah 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 blah. Right? It'll give them the answer based on whatever documentation and standards you have. That's the helpful path for the consumer. The other helpful path internally is if you can data bind the way the tool is collecting that information to give you readouts of insights of things people are looking for. You then created basically a user research function to see like, oh, do we have 20 people coming to this tool every day asking what's the difference between a card and a tile? Maybe we need to do better, right? Maybe we need to fill a gap. Or is this thing giving us insight that like there's a missing feature or a broken function or something? It could serve as another tool to help ensure that the system is doing what it needs to do for consumers and for you, rather than focusing on can we, save development cycles or make code faster? It's like, yeah, all that performance stuff comes by nature of human evolution. Like pause on that for a second. Let's make this a helpful application of this tool. Let's do it as a way to fill a gap that we can't serve as a core team, either because we don't have a core team, right? And we're all doing this like side of desk and don't have time to do support, or the core team is so bogged down because they're supporting so many groups that they don't have time to do one-on-one support, right? Like fill that gap, because the support gap is the thing that keeps systems alive, right? The more they go unsupported, as I'm sure you've experienced too, is the quicker people don't adopt them, the quicker people forget about them, the quicker that second system spins up, right? And all of a sudden you've got another thing competing with the design system, and it creates all sorts of issues.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think the healthcare will also change because of the AI, especially all this digital stuff? I mean, most of the stuff is still offline at the moment, getting digitalized, but it's still quite different, I think, than the experience we will have in 5 years, for example.
No, yeah, 100%. I think you're totally right. I think AI, so I can say, like, I know that, Mayo and many healthcare, organizations are, like, exploring, like, ways to responsibly, safely, and in a way that doesn't violate patient confidentiality. Can AI tooling be used to help, you know, eh, better understand medical jargon? Right? Or collect information and make concepts easier for the average person to understand, right? Or help people find the right tools or people or diagnoses or information. So it's interesting to see how that works on the patient side, like on ways that that potential patients and folks seeking medical care may or may not be able to use these tools or these add-ons to websites to help find information better. But the other interesting use case that I'm just seeing stuff pop up in this space is it's actually being tested and researched, that could it help doctors who, we already know are seeing too many patients in a day, right, are spread too thin. Can it help them better care for their patients by providing meaningful summaries of patient records, or being able to be a second set of eyes on diagnosis, materials and things like that. Mayo is exploring some of these things. I'm not involved in all those conversations. I've just seen, readouts every now and then, but many other health orgs are also looking into these same things. So I think there's going to be some very interesting stuff coming out in the next couple of years about how AI tooling has done the productivity thing, but that it's also helped better create patient outcomes for healthcare providers and the orgs that are supporting it, even, many, many, many degrees away from the design system.
But are you currently using some kind of automation tools or any linters or anything that helps you build the design system?
Yes. Yeah. Inside of our code tech stack, we've got linters that help keep with code clarity. We've got regression testing and a bunch of automated accessibility testing that we do. And some of it's manual to make sure it's, hitting the right things. And then that some of these processes are manual, and fixing them, or there's where like overrides have to occur. But yes, we try to automate as much as we can. But I don't know so much that I'd call that, AI tooling, more so than just normal automation right through engineering flow. We don't have much automation in terms of design, though. We do that on the engineering side because it's kind of natural in the ecosystem, but we haven't found necessarily value yet in the design tool automation in terms of helping speed things up or find gaps. It has been helpful for certain aspects of documentation, right? When we're trying to explain a complex topic or what we feel is a complex topic, but it shouldn't take up 500 words. We need to make it more concise. So using things like ChatGPT have been helpful to, like, all right, here's all the information. Can we make it simpler, right? We want to make sure folks understand this if they don't know system stuff. So using those tools to help us better meet the knowledge set of the people we're serving has been a really helpful thing as well, to make sure that, even in our trainings, we're not being too jargony, or we're not talking about things that are like at the high level, let's call it collegiate level understanding, when maybe folks are more like at the primary school level of understanding, right? We don't want to be talking past them. So things like ChatGPT help us simplify documentation, etc. So that's been a very helpful tool in terms of that side of things.
So, what was your biggest, let's say, whoa, we did that moment that you were really proud of? It doesn't matter if it's Mayo Clinic or anything before, but that you would really like to share and encourage people that would like for in design systems.
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah, I think I've had the privilege to work at three very different organizations and consult for some other organizations that are also very uniquely set up. So I've had the privilege of being able to see how different groups and companies are tackling very similar problems, but dealing with very different internal, cultural, systematic guardrails that shape the way they're able to deliver on that. When I worked at Hologram and was able to collaborate with Kevin Powell, I mean, it was kind of like a fever dream. We were able to move so quickly and do so many things in such a performant and responsible way. It was such an interesting, unique experience. I look back at that time very fondly. I mean, to give you some context, we built and deployed the first version of a true system in 8 months. Not only it included 18 components, over 200 component and semantic level tokens, and we had a full support schema. Now, given let's remember, like, Hologram was a startup, very small company. At the time, there was only 300 people. So and they were planning to scale. That's why they brought in us to work on the system. That like they had plans to get to the thousands in the coming years, and some things happened economically and layoffs and whatever. But at the time, we were building concrete infrastructure for the company to scale rapidly, and we felt really, really confident, really, really good about the work we did in such that short amount of time because we were able to really collaborate with the groups that were there, the core engineers and the core designers before the company scaled, to make sure that the system reflected the products, so that when the next product was able to spin up, it was based on an existing system, right? Rather than having to shoehorn all sorts of stuff in. So it was like right time, right place, right people, right circumstance, right leadership support, and everything just kind of aligned. And it felt really good because we got to try out the 3-week sprint cadence as like an experiment. It worked really well. We got to generate state of the system reports and all sorts of other things to try how we wanted to monitor the system adoption. Because Kevin and I had both worked at very large organizations before, and being at Hologram, because it was so small, gave us a chance to try things hands-on with people in ways that we weren't able to do at such large orgs because we were, that the effort was begun much later in the product life cycle. So being able to start early, gather all the sentiment analysis like I was talking about before, and using that to define your roadmap has been my biggest learning in terms of that, and what's been a valuable exercise. Because what I found is that sentiment analysis stuff, a lot of times it gathers data we already know, right? Folks are like, I wish the system was performant, or I wish it had mobile native or whatever, right? But what it doesn't, what it captures that we forget is it captures verbatims from our consumers. In other words, it takes the ask of like, when they're saying something like, I want, to be able to have dark and light mode, right? Like that's how they understand it. How we understand it is like we need to architect a theming infrastructure, right? Or something like that to support that kind of flipping of modes and all that sort of stuff. So what the sentiment analysis has proven to do, and has been really helpful, is taking the consumer verbatim and mapping it to an item or a roadmap, so that when they see things like theme support, right? In the 2026, exploration, they're like, that's where that thing I asked for is. It's that modes, the dark mode ask or whatever. So being able to take, and I'm just using like one example. Many teams were like, we wish we had these components, or we should have contribution flow, or we wish we had this, that, and the other thing. But being able to log those things at a marker in time, right? And say, okay, we have now gathered data and intel from consumers saying what they want and what they expect from the system. Now let's map those asks to the things we have planned, so that translation and understanding of what those topics are mapped to what we mean, right? And how it architects the greater scheme, so they can keep track of things as they go. So that was like the best thing in terms of like my growth and understanding, and like an aha moment, because it helped make sure that while we know that design systems are such a long tail, it's marathon, not sprint work, right? We know it happens over years of time and then development and ingestion, where product teams work on smaller cycles, right? So this gives us the opportunity to log, implement, and then validate, right? What I mean by that is like you can see that request come through in the exercise. You can map it to your roadmap. You can do that thing, then you can potentially report out on it on the other side, right? In a way that I think oftentimes from what I hear from other practitioners, like they miss that connection layer to make folks that are consuming the system understand the complex, weird, technical, jargony stuff that we're building, right? And how it actually impacts them. And I think sometimes we wait too late to talk about the coolness and the uniqueness and tie it to what they understand after it's already launched, right? And then we're like, oh, they're not using it. What do we do? And it's like, well, we didn't bring them along as we were making the thing, right? So they didn't understand when we did launch it, how it could help them. So by creating this pipeline of information from the sentiment analysis to the roadmap, to the update, to the thing, you bring folks along the whole time of the journey, even if it takes longer than expected, so that they know, oh, that's that thing I'm going to be able to use when it comes out, right? Versus what is this thing you just delivered to me? I don't understand.
Yeah, you're taking care of these gaps that we mentioned before.
Certainly trying to.
Yeah. So I really liked the ad that you posted for the new designer that you're searching for. The like an article where you describe all those things. And now I'm even more excited for anyone that will apply, because yeah, it's a really cool project, a really cool team, and a really cool system that you have there.
Yeah,
And
I'm really
have-
excited.
Yeah, since you have such a responsible job, how do you take care of your work-life balance? What do you do outside of design systems? I saw the doc. What's his name?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the dog that popped in, his name is Pax.
Yeah.
He is my 10-year-old boxer shepherd. He occupies a lot of my time outside of work. I've had him since he was a couple weeks old. He's awesome. But work-life balance is a challenge, right? Especially in remote ecosystems where like I've got teammates across the U.S. So like my job as their manager lead is like to be on when they're on, right? To make sure that I can serve and help them when they need to. So my daily hours are a little bit different than the rest of my team, but that doesn't bother me because I'm a late night person anyway. So I typically work like the 10 to 6, 10 to 7 hour block rather than like the 9 to 5 or 7 to 5 block because it matches them better with my team schedule. So with that, I've tried to bake in intentional time to like not do work and not sit and think about work or be able to explore new topics and new things or do sessions like this so I can make sure it's not all work all the time. It's a hard balance, but that is certainly part of it. But outside of work, I really like to ride my bike here in Raleigh, North Carolina. They have a lot of greenways that go throughout the city, and when the weather's nice, they're paved. It's a beautiful ride to just go through the trees in the middle of the city and just get some fresh air and then do that with friends. And so I like to ride my bike a lot. On most weekends, when the weather's not trash or cold, I play sandlot baseball, which is basically like, you got like real baseball that's like, professional, and then you got like college, and then you've got like rec league, and you keep going down the list on like how serious it is. And like at the very bottom is sandlot. Like we're out there really just to be with people and enjoy and hang out and then, have a beer in the outfield and veg. And then by accident play baseball too, kind of thing. It's very community focused instead of the sport. So I really like it because it drives home the connective tissue between people as opposed to everything being competitive, but while also being able to be out there and playing a sport that we enjoy and like and get some exercise. So it's a nice break from staring at a screen all day.
Yeah, really nice. So, Taylor, thank you so much for all your insights. I think you're winning for insights per minute. This was such an intense podcast, but yeah, I really loved everything that you're doing now, even more. So, really thankful that you joined and shared all of this so transparently.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Romina, you're creating a space here for this sort of thing to happen. So I thank you for even having this as an option, right? To be able to share and think out loud and dig through some stuff. And I want to encourage anyone who listens into this episode, number one, thank you from me and from Romina, right? On chiming in. But please reach out if you have questions or disagree or something. Like we're only as strong as a systems community as we are in our ability to discuss and dig in and critique and build together. So
What's the
doors
best way,
open, right?
the best way to reach out to you on LinkedIn or?
Yeah, I'd say LinkedIn primarily, commenting on articles there, DMing. Right now I'm doing the hiring thing, so my DMs are a bit clouded and hard to respond to. But once that comes through and we're clear of that, that should be a lot easier. But I'm also involved in a lot of the community spaces. So I'm kind of active on X, Twitter, whatever you call it these days. I attend Ben Callahan's weekly session, The Question. I try to get involved in any of the other communities that are out there, like the Slack space, the Dust and Slack, and, into design systems, whatever. So I'm around and I really love when people reach out and want to talk about stuff and dig in. So any channel where you see me, feel like it's totally safe and reasonable to reach out if that's what you'd like to do.
Yeah, thanks so much and see you around on the web.
Sounds good, Romina. Thanks again.